welcome to BugFest Plan B. My name is Sam and I'll be your host today, and I'll be introducing Dr. Joseph Wilson to you to talk about the bees in your backyard. But first, I have a quick tutorial for those of you joining us on Zoom. So with our Zoom, you'll get to see that there's the option to mute and unmute and turn your video on and off. Now, if you're with us with Zoom, just to protect your privacy, we're not going to be allowing people to unmute or mute, and we're going to keep videos off for this program. But the other thing that you should see is the closed captions button at the bottom here, in which you can turn on closed captions and by clicking show subtitle when that pops up. And you can also edit the type of the size of the font and the way that the subtitles will look on our Zoom call here. The other thing that you can do is you can change it into speaker view so that you can focus on what Joe will be talking about today. And you can put it on side-by-side mode so that you can see his presentation as well as his camera too. And you can adjust the size of either the presentation or the camera as well if you need to see things a little bit larger for the cool pictures that he has to show for us today. On Zoom and as well as YouTube, please feel free to use our chat, ask questions and make comments and observations in the chat. But please remember to be a good digital citizen, which means please keep your comments relevant and questions relevant to what we're talking about. And please respect both the presenter as well as your fellow participants. All right, and with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And I want to introduce our speaker today. So again, we are going to get to talk about the bees in our backyard. One type of bug, I guess. And we are going to hear from Dr. Joseph Wilson, who is the Associate Professor of Biology at Utah State University. So thank you so much for speaking with us today, Joe, and I will let you take it from here.
Okay, I'm just gonna make my screen big here. Thanks for everyone for coming. This is gonna be fun. I've been watching some of the other presentations earlier today, and there's lots of cool information being shared out there. So hopefully we can continue with that trend and share some good information. Today I wanna talk about bees, but before I do that, I think I should introduce myself a little bit. I am a biologist, and I study mostly bees and wasps, especially in desert environments. A lot of the time, my family is my field crew. This is my daughter looking for critters in this puddle when I'm collecting bees down in southern Utah. So bees and wasps are my passion, but especially in desert landscapes. I live in Utah, and there are a lot of good desert landscapes to do that kind of research. Before I talk about bees, I want to talk about my other favorite insect, and you can see a few of them here. These are velvet ants. Velvet ants are what I think of as the coolest wasp in the world. If you saw the talk right before this, he talked a little bit about velvet ants. But so some of my research on velvet ants suggests that they have the longest stinger compared to their body out of any bee, wasp, or ant. So there's the stinger coming out on the top left picture. This is a little video. You can see this velvet ant is trying to sting the tweezers that I'm holding it with. And the stinger is not only long, but it's really agile. So velvet ants have a long sting. They are one of the more painful stings as far as the pain index scale, people that let themselves get stung by things and rank it. Some velvet ants, especially these bigger ones, are pretty painful, they say. And so this is a graph here is comparing the sting length to the body out of bees, wasps, and ants. And then on the left here on the graph, you can see velvet ants have a much steeper line. They have longer stingers. They also have a really hard shell, so you can't really crush them. They're just pretty much really cool. So lots of kinds of velvet ants in the world, different patterns in different parts of the country, but we are going to skip over velvet ants now, and we will talk about bees. So I've done surveys, I've talked with people around the country, and I've asked kind of some similar questions. The first question I often ask is on a scale of 1 to 5, how important are bees? And so you can either answer this in the chat, but it's probably most of you are going to say the same thing. When I ask this to people across the country, 99% of the people say bees are important. So there's two things to think about that. Who is the 1% that doesn't think bees are important? But also it's pretty clear that people recognize that bees are important. And now from a bee conservation biologist standpoint, this is awesome because I don't have to convince people that bees are important. They already recognize that fact. And because people recognize that fact, there's lots of efforts that people are undertaking to save the bees. So I periodically do just Google image searches about save the bees to see what I can find. And here's two posters that I found. These are both from the same artist. On the left, we see this poster, Save the Bees, Save Humanity, but there's something wrong with that poster on the left. Anyone have any ideas what it is? Here, let me pull up this other chat window so I can see it too. What's wrong with the poster on the left? Yes, Marianne and some others say that is not a bee. This is, in fact, a yellow jacket wasp. So nobody says save the yellow jackets to save humanity. So that artist made a mistake here. On the right, there's another poster. It has two mistakes. One is that dead yellow jacket wasp at the bottom. This says 30% of our food is pollinated by bees, which is a true statement. The problem is that corn that this artist drew on this poster, corn is wind pollinated. It's not pollinated by bees. So there are mistakes that people make when they are trying to help save the bees. And I should point out, this says NRDC at the bottom here on the poster, Natural Resources Defense Council. They actually contacted me and said, this is not our poster. It turns out this was just a graphic designer putting his portfolio online and using that logo without permission. So graphic designers or other people online can make mistakes, right? You probably see a lot of mistakes on social media or other online sources because anybody can add stuff to the internet. But it's not just random people online making mistakes. I've also seen mistakes in places where I shouldn't see them. So I was at a convention for entomologists, people that study insects. I went to this table in the exhibit hall, and I went to the kids book section because I have some kids. And I went to this book called Exploring the World of Bees. I opened it up to the first page. It says Meet the Bees, and that is not a bee. So online, some people are saying, yes, you are right, that is a fly. So people make mistakes when they shouldn't be making mistakes. And in fact, one of the most common mistakes I see is mistaking a fly for a bee. If you saw the previous talk, that presenter showed some pictures of mimicking flies in his backyard. So I want to take some time to talk about the differences between flies and bees, and especially the flies that look like bees. So we have a fly on the left, a bee on the right. If we were together in person, I would ask you to yell out, what are some differences you see? I see in the chat, some people are noticing some differences. These are the differences that I often notice. So and my kids have learned this too. When we go out in the front yard, they generally start by looking at the face. So flies, especially the flies that look like bees, have really short antennae. Bees, on the other hand, have longer antennae. Flies have really big eyes. Notice the eye on that fly on the left is filling like the whole half of its head. The bee's eyes are relatively smaller. Skinny legs on the fly. The fly does not have pollen collecting hairs. The bee does have thick, stout pollen collecting hairs on its pretty robust legs. And then one thing that people often mention, I don't usually look at this characteristic, but it is a true statement, is that flies have 2 wings and bees have 4 wings. The reason I don't use that characteristic is because when a fly or a bee is sitting on a flower, it's hard to count the wings because the bees fold them over and so do the flies. Also, when it's flying, it's hard to count the wings. So while the wing characteristic is true, it's kind of hard to tell the difference. So I focus on the face and the legs usually. So are you ready for a pop quiz? Oops, clicked the button and it didn't work. On the left, is that a bee or a fly? I'll give you 10 seconds to answer. So on the left, is it a bee or a fly? So I see lots of answers coming in and people are correct. This on the left is a fly. You can tell by looking at the legs and the face, right? It has those big eyes, has the short antennas, and it has skinny legs. So let's try one more. On the left, is it a bee or a fly? This one's a little bit trickier. So on that first one, it looks like everybody said fly. On this one, I'm getting some mixed answers. And it's tricky because if you look at the legs, they look hairy and thick like a bee. But if you look at the head, it is a fly. So this has really big eyes like a fly, and it has really short antennas like a fly. This is called a, what is it called? It's called a robber fly. And this fly is actually a predator of bees. So it looks like a bee to trick predators, but it is in fact a fly. So again, the face is a good characteristic. So now that we are experts in telling bees apart from flies, what about wasps? So wasps can be tricky. We have 3 wasps here on the picture. We have that same bee in the bottom right corner. Some characteristics that people often will tell me that what they use to tell bees apart from wasps is wasps have skinny waists. You can see that to the extreme in this one on the bottom left. Wasps have thin legs and they have very little hair. And not only thin legs, but these kind of really spiky legs. See, all three of these wasps have kind of spikes on their legs. So those are some characteristics people often will use to tell bees apart from, bees apart from wasps. So let's do a quiz here. On the left, is it a bee or is it a wasp? And I'll look at the chat to see if people are answering. It's an easy one, right? Everyone's saying it's a wasp, and it looks like a wasp. One other characteristic that people sometimes will use is they say wasps look mean. And I agree, that wasp looks kind of mean and the bee looks nice and fuzzy and cute. How about these? And so the tricky part here is we have that bee on the top right that we've seen lots of times. But in fact, the other 4 insects on this slide, these are also bees. And so you might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, Joe, you just told me that wasps have skinny legs and they look mean and they don't have very much hair. And this one on the top left has a skinny waist, skinny legs, not very much hair, but I'm telling you that it's a bee. And so the reality is bees are really hard to tell apart from wasps physically. There are some microscopic features that if you have a microscope, you might be able to see, but physically it's hard to tell them apart. Behaviorally, on the other hand, they have some clear differences. The main difference is with their diet. Bees are herbivores. They eat pollen and nectar and feed their babies pollen and nectar. And wasps, most wasps are carnivores. They eat meat and feed their babies meat. And that meat includes your hamburger, includes some roadkill sometimes, but most often it is insects that they hunt and feed their babies. This is a paper wasp that has killed a katydid, and now it is taking a ball of katydid goo to feed back to its babies. So the physical differences that we see, bees are often hairy with thick legs. It's because that is an adaptation to help them collect and carry pollen. Wasps often have less hair and have spiny legs. That is an adaptation to hunt and carry their prey back to their babies. So that's a main difference between bees and wasps. So people want to save the bees. Like I said, I often Google save the bees and just see what's out there. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, Honey Nut Cheerios made this campaign when they wanted to save the bees. You could actually write in a letter and they would send you a packet of wildflower seeds that you could plant to help save the bees. That campaign was kind of short-lived because they failed to recognize that wildflower seeds in some areas are invasive weeds in other areas. So for example, seeds that might grow well in Southern California might be really bad for the environment in Florida, or seeds that grow in Florida might not grow at all in Maine. And so you can't kind of do this broad scale seed campaign because very different plant communities live in different parts of the country. A lot of people do protests against pesticides or genetically modified foods. A lot of these are based on kind of cultural ideas, but what about the science? Like, what does it really do? How do we really save the bees? And step one to saving the bees, I think, is learning about the bees. And so that's what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk, is learning about the bees in your backyard. Most people are familiar with this bee down here in the bottom right corner. That is the European honeybee. It's kind of the poster child for bees. What people don't recognize, though, is that the European honeybee is only one of thousands of different bee species. And many of those bee species, like this little fairy bee on the left, don't really look or act like a European honeybee. They also don't recognize that European honeybees are actually the black sheep of the bee world. So the black sheep in a flock, the idea of this black sheep is that it's different from other sheep, right? And honeybees are actually quite different than other bees. So I want to talk about some of these differences. We have honeybees on the right, and this is a picture of a wild bee. I call it a wild bee because it lives wild here in North America. Another word I use for these wild bees is often native bees, because that's the first difference I want to talk about. Honeybees are actually not native to North America. Someone mentioned this on the chat. And so honeybees are native to Eurasia and Africa. They were brought to North America by European settlers several hundred years ago. So honeybees are not a native species. Honeybees, though, do have a close relationship with humans. I mean, we brought them from Europe when settlers came over here, but they've had an older history with humans. So this is an Egyptian Hieroglyphics, scientists claim that this picture here in the middle is a bee. Looks like a weird wasp to me, but there was a relationship with bees and with ancient Egyptians. There was even older relationships with bees and some of the native peoples in Spain. There's a cave painting in eastern Spain that depicts people harvesting honey from honeybees, like they're climbing up a ladder to harvest the honey in this cave picture. So honeybees are not native to North America. Honeybees also are different because of their biology. Honeybees, as we know, they live in large colonies. There's workers and there's queens. So there's this division of labor. Some of the workers are cleaners, some of them are foragers, some of them are nurses. So honeybees have this kind of complex society. Most native bees, in contrast, are solitary. So a solitary bee means a single female lives alone in her nest. She is the queen and worker all at the same time. They don't live in a big colony and they don't work together like honeybees do. So most wild bees here in North America are solitary bees. Now, even though they're solitary, many of these native solitary bees will nest in big groups. So this is a nesting aggregation of some solitary bees down here in Utah. What a lot of bees will find a patch of dirt or land that they really like, something about the soil consistency or the moisture or other characteristics make that attractive to them. So they nest in these big aggregations. Each bee has its own nest and they don't work together. They are still solitary bees, but sometimes they will nest in these big groups. Sometimes you can have thousands of nests within a couple of square meters. So solitary bees sometimes can be communal. A lot of people call these chimney bees. These are a bee that likes really hard packed dirt, and then they build these chimneys over the nest entrance. We're not exactly sure why they do that. Some hypotheses are that it could reduce parasites. Some people think it could be about flooding. When it rains, the water won't go right down their nest entrance, but we're still not sure why they do it, but it does look very cool. Some of my favorite bees. So most solitary bees, like I said, most bees are solitary. Some of them nest in the ground, like I just showed you. Others nest in pre-existing cavities. So this is a leaf cutter bee. It is carrying a piece of a leaf, and it brings that into a pre-existing hole that it finds and kind of lines that hole like wallpaper. That is in contrast to honeybees, which live in big colonies. Again, there's like 20,000 bees that live in one of these honeybee colonies, a very different lifestyle. So solitary versus colony bees. Inside those solitary bee nests, either in a cavity nesting bee or a ground nesting bee, there's generally a long tunnel, and then they have little nurseries where they put pollen and nectar and lay an egg. So a single female bee will make several rooms and lay eggs in these ground nests on the left. On the right, that's the inside of one of these cavity nesting bee nests, and you can see there are 4 different nurseries in here with pollen and nectar on it. And then if you look at that farthest one on the right, there's a baby bee. It's a bee larva on that pollen mass. So most native bees are solitary. Oops. Can't get my slide to advance. There we go. Another thing to consider with this is many native bees are picky eaters. So they are attracted to certain kinds of flowers, and many of them have a short flight season. Many native bees are only flying around as an adult for maybe 4 to 6 weeks. Honeybees, on the other hand, fly all season long. As soon as it's 55 degrees or so in the spring, they will be out foraging, and they will stay out foraging until the daytime high temperatures get less than 55 degrees. So in some parts of the country, you can have honeybees flying around year round. Most native bees only live for 6 weeks or so. And so there's this different kind of relationship with flowers. Honeybees, because they're flying as soon as it's warm, they are not picky at all about their diet. They will collect pollen from lots of different kinds of sources. Native bees, on the other hand, many of them are picky. So I see on the chat, someone asked, how deep can these ground nests be? Most of them are between like 3 inches to a foot or so. The deepest one that has ever been excavated was 9 feet deep. So a bee that was about a ½ an inch long dug 9 feet down in the ground. And so they're not sure if a single bee dug 9 feet or if that nest was reused year after year after year and subsequent generations kept digging down. It was in some sandy soil in kind of the deserts of central Utah. So dietary preference is something to consider. In the previous several talks, people have talked about some of the diets of bees and medicinal uses of plants for bees. And so later here, we'll talk about some plants that are good for bees, but I'm not going to go into a lot of details. But native bees do have a tight relationship with plants. One other characteristic is, what do bees eat? We often think of bees being associated with honey. That might be because there are a lot of cartoon bears that have taught us that bees are associated with honey. But in fact, it's only the European honeybee that makes enough harvestable honey to actually be useful to humans in the United States and Canada. There are some native bees that will make honey down in southern Mexico in the tropics, but in the US and Canada, it's only the European honeybee that makes honey. The other bees feed their babies, I call it a pollen cake. It's a mixture of pollen and nectar, and there's different consistencies. Sometimes they're more liquidy, sometimes, like this one, is a nice solid pollen cake that the babies will eat. Last thing I want to point out is the size differences. Honeybees are all roughly the same size. I call them honeybee sized. Native bees come in a wide variety of sizes. This is a large carpenter bee sitting on a quarter on the left. So you can imagine how big that is if you can envision a quarter in your mind. Next to that large carpenter bee, we have a fairy bee. And as you can see, fairy bees are pretty small. And that fairy bee there is actually a kind of a medium-sized or large fairy bee. The smallest bee in North America is probably the smallest bee in the world. And it is a really small little fairy bee. It's about 2 millimeters long. That's about as long as George Washington's nose on a quarter there. So native bees look very different than honeybees and often get overlooked because many of these native bees are really small. In this picture here, this is just a scattering of native bees from my area. These are all to scale with each other. So you can see the honeybee down here in the bottom middle. Some native bees are roughly honeybee sized, some are much bigger, and some are much smaller. So a lot of diversity of size and shape and color of native bees. If we don't recognize that diversity, we might be failing to recognize some of the bees that are common in our yards. Another thing to think about is where native bees live. It is not the diversity of native bees is not equally spread. Actually, I should go back to this. I forgot to say there are nearly 4,000 species of native bees in the US and Canada. 4,000, that's a lot. That's quite a bit more than native birds that live in the US and Canada. So if any of you are birders, you know it can be challenging to try to find different rare bird species or identify those sparrows that are in your bushes. Native bees, I think there are roughly 4 times as many native bee species as bird species in the US. So that's a lot of diversity, but that diversity is not equally distributed, just like with birds. So everything east of the Mississippi River in the US, and that actually includes Canada too, there's about 770 bee species, quite a bit of bee species east of the Mississippi River. But just for comparison, in Utah, where I live, we have about 1,100 bee species. So in just the state of Utah, we have nearly 1.5 times as many species of bees as the entire eastern parts of North America. That's pretty interesting. So I usually tell people about this and they think, oh, that's nice. That's cool. There's blue bees. I didn't know that. But then they ask me this question, do they pollinate? And the answer is, yes, they do pollinate. In fact, both native bees and honeybees can be excellent pollinators. So let's talk about honeybees first, because honeybees are what many people think of as the pollinator in the world. So honeybee is important. The pollination services of this was now 20 years ago was valued at $14.6 billion for agriculture. That number has increased year by year. So honeybee pollination services are really valuable in the US. Currently, there's over 2.5 million honeybee colonies in the US. So honeybees are an important pollinator, especially for some of these big agriculture areas that rely on honeybees for pollination. Studies of honeybee pollination show what you might expect. The more honeybees you have in the crop, which is on the bottom axis of this graph, the more seeds or fruits you get in that crop. So that's what this graph shows, is that as you increase honeybees, you increase the fruit or seeds that you are growing. That makes sense. Recent studies, though, suggest that wild bees are also very important pollinators. So let me read this quote from this study. Overall, wild insects pollinated crops more effectively. An increase in wild insect visitation enhanced fruit set by twice as much as an equivalent increase in honeybee visitation. So when we have honeybees, we increase the number of honeybees, you get an increase in the seeds or the fruit. When you add native bees to that equation, you get this spike above what honeybees alone can do. So here's a graph to kind of illustrate this. Again, the quote says, overall wild insects pollinated crops more effectively. This is 100 honeybees. Researchers have shown that you need about 100 honeybees to pollinate. Actually, it's not even that. The job that 100 honeybees can do in an apple orchard can be done by 2 mason bees. So yes, some wild bees, not only are they pollinators, but sometimes they are more effective pollinators. And that the effectiveness of the pollination services between wild bees and honeybees, there's lots of kind of complicated factors that can lead to this. I want to talk just a little bit about some of these behaviors that wild bees can do that honeybees can't. So this study also suggested that pollination by managed honeybees supplemented rather than substituted for pollination by wild insects. So we usually think of honeybees as the pollinators of our crops, and then the wild bees might help out now and again. But in fact, this and several other studies have shown that wild pollinators are the main pollinators for many of these crops, and honeybees are supplementing those wild pollinators. And the question might be, or it should be, why? Like, why are wild pollinators doing so much more work than honeybees? And a part of it is the behavior. I mentioned that some wild bees are picky eaters. So this is a longhorn bee. And some studies show that longhorn bees are really effective pollinators of sunflowers. And that's because longhorn bees have a preference for sunflowers. They prefer to forage on sunflower flowers, that's funny. Sunflowers over other bees. Over other flowers. And they've also shown that these longhorn bees will actually move between rows of sunflowers more effectively than honeybees. And so they are cross-pollinating those flowers, leading to a higher yield in these sunflower fields. Another wild bee that has been shown to be an excellent pollinator is called a squash bee. This is a little video. This is a little video of a squash bee in my pumpkin flower. So squash bees are strict specialists. They only collect pollen from squash flowers. Squash includes pumpkins and zucchinis and yellow crookneck squash, all that kind of plants. So this is a squash bee foraging in my pumpkin flower. This is a female. And you can see that, so she's down at the bottom getting some nectar and she's getting pollen on her as she is foraging around. She stops for a second and starts grooming herself. She starts with her face and scrapes all the pollen off her face and her tongue. Then she moves that pollen down her body to her middle legs. Then she moves it from her middle legs to her hind legs. So she is very clean about how she forages on these flowers. In a second, you'll see a male squash bee come in here. Males are not collecting pollen. They just have one thing on their mind, and that's mating. So it comes to try to mate with this female bee. The female bee rejects his proposal, and they both fly off. Notice the male bee doesn't take the time to groom himself before he goes searching for other bees and other flowers. And so this study on the left here that I'm highlighting suggests that male bees actually do a lot of the pollination in squash flowers because they move from flower to flower as they're looking for females, and they don't groom themselves as much in between flower visits. So squash bees are really important for our pumpkin pollination. When you're eating pumpkin pie, think of the squash bees. One other aspect of many native bees that honeybees just don't have the ability to do is this thing called buzz pollination. So there are several kinds of flowers that don't release their pollen very easily. This is a tomatillo flower in my garden. It's related to tomatoes and eggplants. And that whole group of flowers, they kind of hold on to their pollen tightly inside the flower. Honeybees don't know how to get the pollen out. Some of the wild bees have evolved this behavior called buzz pollination. They can actually vibrate their body at a certain frequency, causing the pollen to be released from the flower. So in this video, you see this is called a polyester bee. This polyester bee is moving around the flower. Right here, I slow the video down and she's vibrating, and you see little teeny pollen grains flying out of the flower. So she is buzz pollinating that flower. Studies have shown that you get more tomatoes and bigger tomatoes on the tomato plants when you have buzz pollinators around. The same is true for this bee lives in the southeastern US. It's called the blueberry bee. The blueberry bee is a good buzz pollinator, and it favors blueberry flowers. You get more blueberries and bigger blueberries when the flowers are visited by this blueberry bee rather than European honeybees. So buzz pollination is an important kind of behavior that many of these wild bees can do. Honeybees just don't have that behavior. So all of that is kind of just to to say that fruit set is at its greatest when honeybees and native bees complement each other. Also, native bees can provide insurance against honeybee losses or climate change or pesticides. So we need to be considering native bees as important pollinators. But one thing that makes it more complicated is that the context really matters. So many of these studies are done on smaller scale farms, often in the eastern US, and many of these farms kind of look like this. So you have the farm, surrounding the farm, you have some woodlands, and you have some native forests kind of nearby. And so in small scale farms like this, it has been shown that wild bees do the majority of the pollination. But not all farms in the US look like this. So this is an almond orchard in California in February when it's blooming. And you can see it is row after row after row of blooming almond trees surrounded by row after row of almond trees blooming, and then some grasses. There's not a lot of native vegetation here, either in the orchard or surrounding the orchard. And so for a few weeks in February, there is a lot of resources for bees. But a few weeks later, after the bloom is done, there are no flowers. And so this is basically a desert for bees. And so these large scale farms have relied on honeybees. You drive them in a truck, you drop them off, and when the flowers are done blooming, you pick them up and you drive them somewhere else. This kind of agriculture, these big, large farms, they're not very conducive to pollination by native bees because there's no place for the native bees to live and no forage for the native bees after that crop is done blooming. So in agriculture settings, small scale farms, the majority of the pollination is done by wild bees. Large scale farms are built around this idea of honeybee pollination. And so I would suggest that agriculturalists should shift their way of thinking and think, how can we incorporate native vegetation into this landscape to provide habitat for native bees? And then we can get these free pollination services from these native bees. What about in wildlands though? So we've talked about pollination in agricultural settings, but many of the wildflowers we have around the world rely on native bees for pollination and seed set as well. This is one of those super blooms in the foothills of California from several years ago. A lot of these flowers rely on native bees. So I'm just going to mention a few studies, but basically it shows that even in wild settings, honeybees and native bees can sometimes compete. They compete for resources and they compete for space. But if you think about it, one of those honeybee hives has 20,000 bees in it or more. So here there's two hives together, and that has probably 40 to 50,000 bees that need to eat. So when we add honeybee hives into a landscape, we are now adding, tens of thousands of new bees that need food. And so there's competition for pollen and nectar resources there. Also, it's kind of interesting, this study here suggests that honeybees disrupt the structure of plant pollinator networks. And what they found is that even among generalist wild bees that are not very picky, honeybees interrupt the linkages between generalist bees and the plants that they visit, reducing the fruit set in native plants. So it's not just that honeybees are replacing native bees in these wild settings, it's actually the competition between honeybees and native bees has a negative overall effect on the fruit set in these native plants. So honeybees can have a bad influence on native bees, especially in wild landscapes. And again, context matters. So in the West, some times in the year, like I think this is in March in Death Valley, there are lots of flowers. So here, the competition will be relatively low because there is enough forage for wild bees and native bees. At other times of the year, this is later in the summer in the Mojave Desert, there is very little forage for the native bees. And so if honeybees are around, the competition is very, very high. The same thing happens in our backyards. If we have a honeybee hive, which is a totally fun hobby, right? You can harvest your honey, you can work with the bees. That is a good hobby for people, but we need to recognize that there needs to be enough food for the honeybees and the native bees. A professor in England once said this quote, and I really liked it. He says, raising honeybees to save pollinators is like raising chickens to help birds. And I should explain this because some of you might be thinking, wait a second, I like honeybees. I have chickens in my backyard. I'm one of those backyard chicken parents, I guess. We have like 10 chickens and they're fun. They're great birds. They give us eggs. They eat our kitchen scraps. Chickens are important birds. Worldwide, chickens are very important. But if you want to see more hummingbirds in your yard or more warblers or finches, you don't go and buy more chickens. And in fact, if you buy too many chickens in your yard, that will reduce the number of wild birds you see in your yard. It's the same thing with honeybees. Honeybees, we should think of them as kind of like livestock. They are not a wild animal. And basically, they do best when they have a caretaker. A beekeeper is called a beekeeper because they help maintain the health of these beehives. They are kind of like livestock. And yes, there are cattle that will range out in the woods or range out in the plains. Those cows are not wild animals either. They're important and they are part of our agriculture system, but they are not wild animals. And I want people to recognize that. So I am not necessarily anti-honeybee, even though it might sound like I'm anti-honeybee, but I do think we should recognize that if we want to save the bees, honeybees should not be the target. So how do we help bees in our neighborhoods and in our backyards? There are several ways to attract bees to your yard. I'm going to talk about two things that all bees need. Bees need food and bees need nesting habitat. And so it's actually pretty easy to make some small changes in your yard to support native bees. The first thing is we should plant flowers. Now, some of these are extreme. This person converted their whole front yard on the left into flowers. And yes, they have a lot of kinds of bees in their yard. On the right here is my front yard, and in my front garden area, I used to have ivy when I first moved in. I ripped out the ivy and put in various kinds of plants, some native plants and some non-native plants. But I tried to plant a variety of sizes and shapes and colors of plants. If you're designing a pollinator garden, you should first think of plants that bloom at different times of the year. In spring, there's going to be certain plants that bloom, and those will provide food for those springtime bees. In the summertime, there's often different plants that bloom in the spring, and then same within the fall. So for example, sunflowers are blooming right now in most parts of the country, but in May, there's not very many sunflowers that bloom. And so if you can plant plants that will provide flowers for bees at different times of the year, then you can support a diverse community of native bees. And I said different sizes and shapes and colors. So there are lots of kinds of flowers. I have Russian sage here in the back, and those flowers are small and purple and kind of a different shape than these flowers in the front, which are in the family Asteraceae that look more like daisies or something like that. So a variety of flowers provide for a variety of bees. Here's another pop quiz for you. These are two kinds of sunflowers. Which one of these do you think is more attractive to native bees? The one on the left or the one on the right? I'm just looking at the chat as it comes in.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's a lot of people that are saying left.
Yep, that's impressive. So often when I give this little quiz in a presentation, people choose the one on the right. But those of you that have answered in the chat are correct. In large part, the one on the left is in fact way more attractive to native bees. There was a specific study on these two kinds of sunflowers. The one on the right is called a starburst. What do you say that? Panache? I don't know how do you say it. I Googled it and that's what came up. But one of the descriptors of this flower on the right when you're buying these seeds, it says these are pollen-free flowers. That could be a big red flag. If they're pollen-free, that is taking away the food source for a lot of these bees. Yes, they might visit it for nectar, but many of the native bees are after pollen and nectar. And you can often tell when you're at your plant nursery, the flowers that might be more attracted to bees are often the simpler looking flowers. So for example, I don't have a picture here, but there's Gerbera daisies that you often see in bouquets, and then there's wild daisies. The Gerbera daisies have extra rows of petals, and they just look a little bit more full, just like this starburst sunflower on the right has extra rows of petals. It's kind of a hybrid of sorts, and so it is less attractive. Let's try one more flower. A rose on the left and a rose on the right. Which one is more attractive to bees? Very good. Everyone's guessing the one on the right, because now we know sometimes these fancier flowers are not as attractive to bees. This is a wild rose on the right. Lots of bees like the wild roses. In my 20 plus years of studying bees, I have only seen one bee on this rose on the left, and I think it was just sleeping in there. I don't think it was actually foraging. So not all flowers are created equal. One flower that I wanted to highlight is milkweed. So a lot of people around the country are planting milkweed to support monarch butterflies. The monarch caterpillars feed exclusively on milkweed. And I did a study last couple of years to see what kind of native bees visit milkweed. And I found over 280 different bee species that visit milkweed. So if you plant milkweed as part of your pollinator garden, you can be supporting monarch butterflies and providing nectar for a lot of native bees. What's interesting is that the native bees aren't really collecting pollen from the milkweed flower, because milkweed has this weird pollination system when they have like a little packet of pollen. But anyway, native bees do visit milkweed for nectar. So we've talked about food for native bees. What about habitat? And so to provide habitat for ground nesting bees, what you need to do is provide some ground. Often these ground nesting native bees like bare patches of dirt. They don't like a lot of vegetation covering it. So in between my flowers in my front yard, I have left some bare dirt. I try to avoid thick layers of mulch or ground cloth to provide habitat for bees. And in fact, in this dirt right here on the right, I have these little sweat bees that are nesting there that we see on the left. Now you might be thinking, okay, so in Utah, it's dry enough that I don't get a lot of weeds if I'm not watering that dirt. But in other parts of the country, if you just leave bare ground, it's going to be a weed patch in no time. And that's true, right? So there are different things we have to do. Sometimes you can hoe off the top of that bare dirt to keep it bare. Sometimes you can dump some sand, and maybe those sand nesting bees will nest there. Or just leave a corner of your yard that's wild. Let the weeds grow there and let them have that kind of natural weedy vegetation that some bees really like to nest in. Some bees prefer sand, some bees prefer clay, some bees prefer moist soil, some bees prefer dry soil, some like slopes. And so with 4,000 different kinds of bees and 85% of these nesting in the ground, there are lots of different preferences that they will have. Some bees will even nest in your lawn. But the key is if you can leave some part of your land, your garden or your yard a little bit more wild. Bees don't really like the heavily cultivated yards like we seem to prefer. So if that has to be a back corner of your yard so your neighbors won't see it, try leaving that back corner a little bit wild. There are other options though. If you just can't get yourself to leave a weed patch somewhere, you can build some bee nest blocks. I call these bee hotels. You could buy a bee hotel. This one on the right is a store-bought one, or it's really easy to make them. This one on the left is a bee hotel I have in my yard. I just drilled a bunch of holes in a piece of wood. And people ask, okay, what diameter of hole? How deep do they have to be? Well, there are dozens and dozens of species of bee that will nest in these bee nest boxes. Bigger bees like bigger diameters of holes, smaller bees like smaller diameters. So drill a variety of sizes of hole in a piece of wood and bees will nest there. These are 2 leafcutter bees nesting in my bee hotel. Another way that I have had a lot of success with bees nesting in my yard is by making a bundle of reeds as a bee hotel. So I use these reeds out here in the West. This is Phragmites and it's an invasive reed. There are basically any hollow stemmed plant you can cut and bundle together. You try to leave one end closed and one end open. I have bundled these together in a big bundle. This is a leafcutter bee that is looking around for her nest entrance. Cool thing about the bee hotels is most of the bees that nest in these are very docile. I'm only about 4 inches away from this bee hotel while I'm filming this. And again, you can see she's totally ignoring me as she looks for her nest. You can have many kinds of bees nesting here. This is a leafcutter bee. You see some of the green on these nest entrances. Those green plugs are pieces of leaves from other bees that have nested there. But you also could have mason bees nesting in there that use mud to make their nests. I also get some native solitary wasps nesting in my bee hotels. This is called a grass carrying wasp. They hunt tree crickets, which look like little leaf bugs or little katydids. They paralyze the tree cricket, stick it into one of those nest spots, and then they shove dead grass in front of it. That's why they're called grass carrying wasps. Again, they're pretty docile and pretty harmless. So I would encourage you to build a bee hotel if you want to provide some habitat for these cavity nesting bees. And now there's a lot of information online about how to be a good bee hotel owner. I am a very hands-off hotel owner. As a biologist, I like to see the way that nature is interacting, including some of the parasites that can be involved. And so one way to think of this is over the last couple of years, we have all become familiar with the term social distancing. We social distance to avoid spreading disease to our colleagues and friends. When you make this bee hotel, you are taking away the natural social distancing that bees will do. In nature, they're finding a hole in a hollow log over here or in a dead tree over here. We are now concentrating these bee nests into one area, and they won't fight with each other. They nest just fine. But because we have reduced that social distancing, you can spread diseases and you can spread parasites and you can spread pathogens around these. So there are funguses that will sometimes infect these bee hotels. There are parasitic wasps that will sometimes infect this, and mites that will sometimes infect this. So if you leave your bee hotel in the same area for too long, you can increase the parasite load on those bees. So if you start over every couple of years, or you take a couple of years off every now and then, you can help disperse out those parasites. But there's lots of instructions online that we don't need to go through right now. So my main goal here is to teach people about bees so you can be aware of bee diversity. So I have to throw one of these bee puns in there somewhere, else I'm not a good bee scientist. But so when you are aware of bee diversity, then you can take steps to help protect bees. If you don't recognize that there are little teeny fairy bees that might be in your yard, you might miss the opportunity to help protect those fairy bees. And so to be aware of these bees, there are a lot of resources, and I'm going to just plug my own resources because that's what people do. So the first one of these I want to highlight is a book me and my friend wrote called Bees Are the Best. This is a kid's book, as you might tell from the cover here. So the idea is there's this honeybee named Honey, and she goes out into the world for the first time thinking that bees are the best. She meets a bunch of other bees like bumblebees and sweat bees and realizes that not all bees are like her. And so instead of she changes her way of thinking from thinking bees are the best because they're all like me. She recognizes that bees are the best because there's lots of different ways to be a bee. And then at the end of the book, we have the characters in the book as cartoons, and then the real bee that they were modeled after, and then some facts about those bees that you will be introduced to in this book. So there's one of those. I have a book that just came out this month that will be very applicable to many people on this Zoom meeting. It's called Common Bees of Eastern North America by Princeton University Press. This is a true field guide. So it's the size of a field guide, and here's just two example pages. So it has the bees, I didn't show on these pages, it has a distribution map, and it tells you how to identify these bees from some of their relatives. Now, there are 750 bee species in the eastern US. We did not highlight all 750 species. We chose the common ones that you are probably most likely to encounter in your backyard, and some really interesting, maybe more rare ones. So that is available, and the easiest place is probably Amazon, but local booksellers hopefully will be carrying it too. And then lastly, this is a book me and my colleague Olivia, who has written most of the books with me, did several years ago, The Bees in Your Backyard. We also maintain various social media sites where you can learn about bees. The Bees in Your Backyard is more of an overview of the bees in North America, not necessarily an identification guide. And with that, I will leave these kind of the social media stuff on there so you can write it down or take a screenshot or whatever. And I would love to answer some questions. I haven't been monitoring the chat very effectively. So
yeah, we've had some great questions and observations in both our Zoom and YouTube chats. So I will start going actually really quickly, because there was a question about making the bee hotels. Marianne was wondering, can you drill a few holes into a tree without killing the tree, but yet provide a cavity for a few social distance bees?
So the problem with doing it in a live tree is live trees do not like to be drilled into, and they have lots of defenses against insects that will chew into them. Like sap, for example, is one of those. So if you could drill a hole and keep it open, bees would probably nest in there. So you could drill a hole and put a straw in it, like a paper straw. Plastic straws lead to fungus growth and the bees die. But if you put a paper straw in there, it might work. In nature, they actually generally nest in abandoned beetle burrows in dead trees. So the beetles will burrow in there, the beetle larva will, and chew its way into the tree. When that tree dies, there's just an empty hole, and that's where they prefer to nest. So they really prefer dead wood. I have done it from like a fence post. I have also taken a stump that my neighbor chopped out of a dead tree, and I just hung that up in a tree and drilled holes. So they're not super picky, but the dead wood seems to work better than live wood.
Okay, great. And we did have questions. I mean, here in North Carolina, we have clay soils. So you mentioned that there were some bees that did nest in clay. How do they manage to like get into the clay?
So they actually chew it with their mandibles. There's a bee that lives out there called Tilithrix bombiformis. I don't know if it has a common name. It looks kind of like a bumblebee, but it has kind of bigger and hairier legs. It will actually go to some water and land on the water like a water strider. It lands on the water and it will fill its stomach with water, fly that back to the clay and spit it out. And then it uses its mandibles and its front legs to dig in there. So it will dig with that moist clay, and it makes these little clay balls that it actually throws out of the hole. And then it goes back to the water, gets more water to bring back to the clay, and it will dig down a foot or so, and it makes a little chimney on the top of it. But yeah, so they actually use their jaws and their front legs to dig. You can tell how old a bee is by how worn down its mandibles are. When it's really fresh, they have some teeth on the end of the mandibles, but when they're old, those mandibles get worn down as they're chewing through the dirt.
Wow, that's so impressive. Just
Super
like
cool.
thinking of like a little bee being able to dig like feet into the ground.
I know, isn't it crazy?
Yeah.
It's very impressive. So the whole thing about busy bees, we think of that as honeybees in their hive, but these solitary bees potentially are more busy because they're digging and foraging and providing for their offspring all at the same time.
Definitely. Okay, we have a question. Back when you were talking about the orchid bees, did you say where the orchid bees were native to?
Did I talk about orchid bees?
I might have missed that. Okay.
I totally will though.
Maybe not. Maybe I missed that. But
no,
someone
okay.
asked, are orchid bees native bees?
So orchid bees are super cool bees, mostly found in the tropics in Central and South America. They have really long tongues. They look like little jewels because most of them are metallic blue or green. There are some orchid bees that live in Florida. And native is tricky because some people suggest they came in from the Caribbean on like hurricanes brought them in. And so they live there, and they haven't necessarily always lived there, but they also aren't necessarily invasive in the same way that we think of as invasive. So, but Southern Florida is the only place you will see orchid bees in the US. There has been actually one or two collected in Southern New Mexico that might have been off track from coming up the mountains of Mexico and ends up in those mountainous areas in Southern New Mexico. But yeah, there are established populations in Southern Florida.
Okay, great. And we did have a couple questions about honeybees as far as them being like where they're native to, and also how did they come over to the United States?
Honeybees?
Yeah.
So honeybees are native. There's actually like 8 species of honeybees in the world. Mostly the one that people are associated with is from Europe and Asia, but there's also a subspecies that's from Africa. So it's Europe, Asia, and Africa is kind of where they're native to. They came over with the first pilgrims that came and established settlements in the eastern seashore of North America. They brought honeybees with them. As European settlers moved west, they brought honeybees with them west. And so the same was
transported the entire hives onto their ships.
They totally did. They put the hive on a boat, probably closed off. So the cool thing about honeybees is all that honey in there is food storage for them. So you can actually close up the hive and transport it across the ocean or across the country on a wagon or whatever. And so that's what they would do. And then, of course, many of those honeybees would escape and kind of become feral hives. So there are like, quote, wild hives all across North and South America where those honeybees have kind of become feral. They're not a wild animal like I would think of it, but they are living wild lifestyles.
Yeah, as opposed to like the more domesticated ones that you think
Exactly.
of when you think of the ones over here. Okay.
Yep.
All right, wonderful. I think those are the majority of the questions that I saw in the chat.
Yeah.
I know Rexon was asking what is the biggest bee in North Carolina, which is, I looked it up, so I don't know if there's a bigger one, but I was assuming carpenter bee.
It's probably in North Carolina, it'd probably be the carpenter bee, but some queen bumblebees are actually roughly the same size.
Cool.
But the queen comes out in the spring and it starts a hive underground in like an abandoned rodent burrow, and then you see the worker bumblebees. So in the spring you'll see some really big bumblebees. They're yellow and black, but then you won't see them during the summer. Then again in the fall they make new queens that come out and hibernate for the next year.
Interesting. Okay, I'll have to keep an eye out for those.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right, wonderful. Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Joe, for speaking with us, and thank you to you all for tuning into our talk. And we hope that you all had fun learning more about native bees. Again, with the honeybees getting the majority of the publicity, it's cool to see that there are, 4,000 other species that we don't get to hear about as much.
Yeah.
And I am going to pull up a slide here. Quickly. Go. Okay. And oh, there's my computer can see it. There we go. Okay. All right. So I did want to thank BASF for their sponsorship of BugFest this year. And as always, thank you so much to our museum members who help make events like BugFest possible. If you join or renew your museum membership, you can get one of these BugFest t-shirts for free. And there are lots of other programs that are really awesome that are going to be scheduled for this week. So we'll post a link in our chat for how to register for those programs. And again, this recording is available on YouTube after this. And so if you wanted to rewatch the talk and learn again about all of the fascinating bees that Joe talked about, you can rewatch it through YouTube. And thank you all so much again for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.